Thanks, Danielle, and I echo your sentiments. We really appreciate everyone joining us today. We're going to have an excellent program, and we have a stellar lineup of speakers that'll be sharing their long-time experience with land conservation in the Delaware Watershed. For folks who I haven't met, my name is Kelly Knutson. I'm serving as the director for the Coalition of the Delaware River Watershed, otherwise known as the acronym CDRW. We're a network of over 175 different organizations, all dedicated to protecting the natural resources within the basin. And really similar to the LWCF Coalition, our members, we range from small groups on the front lines of water protection to those national environmental groups advocating for conservation policy. So CDRW, we add value to our members through advocacy support, communications assistance, information sharing, networking, and more. So Danielle, I'll have you advance the next slide. So as many on the call may know, the Delaware River is one of the Mid-Atlantic's most important and unique natural resources by really flowing through 4 states and supplying drinking water to over 13.3 million people across the region. The mighty Delaware, of course, it begins in the Catskill Mountains. It flows south through Trenton and Philadelphia along the borders of New Jersey and Pennsylvania until it eventually reaches the Atlantic Ocean. Just additionally, the Delaware River, it supports the second largest population of migrating shorebirds in North America, and it provides over 200 fish species with its habitat, including some of those endangered species like the Atlantic sturgeon. We also have the largest population of American horseshoe crabs in the country. So we find to think that's pretty awesome. This waterway, of course, is incredibly diverse, from the cold streams of the upper Delaware to the bustling cityscapes and to the Delaware Bay Area, all supporting a unique blend of communities, wildlife, and landscapes. Economically speaking, the watershed, it supports over 25 billion in an annual economic activity that includes everything from recreation, ecotourism, hunting and fishing, but also about an estimated 21 billion in ecosystem services. And that includes, of course, water filtration, carbon sequestration, and prized habitats such as forests and wetlands. All of these mentioned, right, are helped further protected through the Land Water Conservation Fund. So Danielle, I'll have you go to the next slide. So CDRW, we partner really closely with the Appalachian Mountain Club and many other partners who have really been leading the way on full permanent funding of the Land Water Conservation Fund. And yearly, you'll see here on the screen, our coalition convenes with members of Congress in Washington, D.C., and also via Zoom, as we're doing now, to advance LWCF and really to highlight successes of the fund throughout the region amongst our other legislative requests. LWCF, it's one of the most important source of federal dollars for conservation, funding many different types of projects and grants that you'll hear a lot more about today. And really our purpose here in assembling this program and this audience is really to gain a deeper understanding of all the different tools in the LWCF toolbox. And really, how can we all work across both programmatic and jurisdictional boundaries to achieve the greatest conservation impact in the watershed? So some big tasks. Again, we'll dive into those deeper. And again, appreciate folks joining us. Really, each one of us too can support the development of more projects utilizing LWCF and leveraging other funding sources to achieve our individual organizational goals and the common goals, again, that we all share. Really hope that you all enjoy the presentations today. Again, there's going to be plenty of time for questions at the end, so just feel free to enter those into the question box at the bottom of your screen, and we hope to have some robust discussion towards the end. But I'll have you transition, Danielle, to the next slide. And before we hear from our panelists, I'll just briefly introduce some of these folks. First, we're going to hear from Amy Lindholm of the Appalachian Mountain Club, who helps lead the National LWCF Coalition and can talk about the recent legislative achievements. Then we'll hear from Kyle of the Conservation Fund, who will show some examples of how LWCF has been used to protect federal public lands in the watershed and for conservation easements through the Forest Legacy Program. Next up will be Carol from the New Jersey Highlands Coalition, who will provide some examples of LWCF-funded Highlands Conservation Act projects. Then we're going to hear from Sarah of Camden Community Partnership, who will talk about Sadler's Point Waterfront Park Project, which has utilized funds from the newest LWCF-funded grant program, specifically targeting urban and underserved communities. You may be familiar with the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program, or ORLAP, as some people refer it to. So after that, we're really excited to welcome staff from the state offices that administer LWCF state and local assistance or stateside grants. We have Ashley and Alex from Pennsylvania, Courtney from New Jersey, we've got Bob of Delaware, and thanks, Bob, again for graciously joining us as well. So we're really interested to hear what priorities and challenges these states share, where they diverge, and then how their approach and process is, each work best for them. So with all that said and out of the way, we can dive into today's content. I'm proud to pass it off to Amy Lindholm. Amy, feel free to take it away.
Thanks, Kelly. And thank you all for joining today. Your support for the Land and Water Conservation Fund and the great work that many of you have done on projects throughout the watershed through many long years, and joining with us through CDRW and the National LWCF Coalition in advocacy before Congress was critical to the ultimate success of the campaign for full permanent funding of our most important source of federal dollars for conservation and recreation access. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Amy Lindholm, and I help coordinate the National LWCF Coalition. So work closely with Danielle and Mark Zakutansky, who many of you know in our Bethlehem office. And we have been at it on this campaign for a solid decade. So it's hard to believe sometimes still that we were able to get full permanent funding passed through Congress by an overwhelming bipartisan vote against many, many odds in a difficult year. So I'm going to talk a bit about that. Danielle, can you go to the next slide? But first, step back in time to the genesis of LWCF, which started in the middle of the last century, when a few key patterns started to converge. You had the rise of the automobile made national parks accessible to a big new middle class. Natural resource extraction was reaching a level of automation that became very visible in the landscape, and the landscape was no longer really empty anywhere. And the dynamics of a growing population fed a housing boom that threatened to completely overbalance green space and recreational opportunities in some parts of the country, especially ones like the Mid-Atlantic and the Delaware River Watershed. So the Eisenhower and Kennedy administrations studied these patterns and came up with the idea for what we now know as LWCF, which made its way through the legislative process and was signed by LBJ in September 1964. So this is an idea that was bipartisan from the very beginning and remains overwhelmingly so today. Next slide. In the nearly 60 years since then, LWCF has touched every corner of America, every state, every congressional district, every county almost, specifically tailored to the needs of each community at the given time because it's very flexible and it works from the ground up. So we rolled out a new map this year that for the first time brings together data from all 10 LWCF subprograms. There's 4 federal land management agencies and 6 different state and local grant programs under the LWCF umbrella. So this is the first time that the data from the states and all of those agencies has been put in one map to show the true breadth and depth of the impact of this one overarching program, which is really stunning if you zoom all the way in. I urge folks to follow that link, and I'll put it in the chat later, and zoom in, because this level of dots doesn't even show you. Once you get further in, the dots explode outward and there's just thousands and thousands of them. So it's pretty cool to see. And it's even more stunning when you consider that before 2020, we had never been able to fully utilize the tools LWCF provides, because while the designated money was set aside every year for LWCF, more than half of that was diverted to other unrelated things. Next slide. So fixing that injustice and unleashing the true power of the program is what the LWCF Coalition focused on for the last 10 years. And with your help, our job was to connect the real people and real communities benefiting from these projects with the national conversation happening in Washington, D.C. So instead of this intangible thing or described in numbers, $300 million a year, $350 million a year, LWCF became a story about all of these things you see here. about historic preservation at places like Valley Forge, about protecting clean drinking water in Sterling Forest, about, maximizing the recreation economy, which has been growing and growing in the Delaware Water Gap. A growing appreciation of the importance of conservation for climate resilience. Wetlands, refuges have played a huge role in that. The need for more and more urban parks and access to nature in urban and suburban areas, and of course trails and trail corridors like the AT. So telling that story firsthand with local partners, land trusts, mayors, businesses, recreationists in their own words is what really brought us to success. Next slide. And so it goes to show you, I kind of am rehashing history a little bit because I want to show what it is truly possible to accomplish when we work together. Despite increasing polarization in Congress, we leveraged pressure from LWCF actually briefly expiring a couple of times in 2015 and 2018 to build the case for permanence, and first passed a permanent reauthorization in the Dingell Act in 2019. And then springboarded off of that to pass full permanent funding the next year in the Great American Outdoors Act. Next slide. So that means now we have this really solid floor to stand on of consistent funding for LWCF at $900 million annually for the full suite of the tools that you're going to hear about today. I can't overstate how amazing it is to have the level of bipartisan support that we had and continue to have. You see these numbers of how lopsided the votes were in the House and the Senate, but it's really imperative that we keep that recipe for success moving forward to face new, really serious challenges in conservation, the climate and nature crises that are happening, the growing awareness of huge disparities in access to quality parks and green space, what some call the nature gap. There's just a lot of work to do. Next slide. So while we continue to celebrate the huge victory of GAOA, the LWCF Coalition is turning its focus on making GAOA a success, right? Implementation, to ensure that we get LWCF dollars into the ground, make sure they're reaching previously underserved communities, and increase access for all to the outdoors. As always, we are seeking to tell the story of how each project has specific local benefits to people and the economy, but also broad global benefit in combating the climate crisis. There's really unprecedented opportunity, given that that full funding is going to be consistent year on year, for partners to think big, think ahead, increase the pace of conservation in urban, suburban, and rural areas. But there's also really unprecedented need, with a football field's worth of natural area being lost to development every 30 seconds across the US. There are unprecedented challenges in scaling up what is a very decentralized program like this one that relies on community partners coming together to solve complex land use problems, often with limited expertise and resources to understand the different tools in the toolbox, how to write grant applications that are different in every state, where to find matching funds, et cetera, et cetera. So that's why we're here today in one of many efforts to fill these gaps. Next slide. So I'm going to pass it on to Kyle to talk more about how federal side LWCF funds invested in the Cherry Valley National Wildlife Refuge have leveraged and built upon others in the AT corridor and throughout the watershed, how these in turn can be leveraged by looking across boundaries and using different tools. And so although this one is not a conservation fund project, I wanted to just highlight quickly that there is another federal side project that is in the president's budget for this year, FY22, through the National Park Service Agency priority list at the Upper Delaware Scenic and Recreational River, which will guarantee permanent public use of a key river access point that's currently owned by the Boy Scouts of America, and which, if lost to developers, would limit access to the next nearest access is like 6 miles away. And there's also irreplaceable archaeological sites on this parcel as well. So just an example of what is still at stake as we all work together to make LWCF work on the landscape. So Kyle.
Thank you, Amy. All right. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. I think I'm even wearing the same shirt as I am in the picture there, so that's nice. Anyone who's not familiar with us here at the Conservation Fund, we're a national nonprofit organization. We've been around since 1985. We work in all 50 states, and we've protected over 8 million acres all across the country to date. So for LWCF implementation and all the other types of funding that are out there, our field staff assists agencies and partners to help get conservation acquisition deals done. We have a dual mandate for both economic development and also environmental conservation. And we're a partner-driven organization. So our goal is to help our agency and NGO partners achieve their conservation goals. We're not necessarily pursuing our own agenda to own and operate preserves, parks, or anything like that, but really to help support with bridge financing, real estate expertise, and project management to help get projects done. So today I'm going to focus on the Pennsylvania American Water Project, which is a successfully completed project thanks to lots of different funding sources and LWCF. And then I'm going to quickly highlight current forest legacy project that we're working here in Pennsylvania. Danielle, next slide. Thank you. All right, so the Pennsylvania American Water property, which is shown on the map in front of you, was one of the largest unprotected tracts along the Kittatinny Ridge in Pennsylvania. At 4,662 acres, the conservation benefits of this tract are tremendous. There's about 5 miles of the Appalachian Trail, which goes right through the center of the property, which is shown in the brown dotted line. The footpath itself was protected by an easement, but there is no buffer protection for the trail corridor. So if these lands were to be sold for development, they could put homes or any sort of development essentially right up to the trail. Property fills in a keystone gap in Pennsylvania's largest important bird area, which serves as a globally significant fall migration flyway used by tens of thousands of raptors and vultures, millions of songbirds. The forest has high quality habitat there for cerulean warblers and other neotropical bird species. There's about 77 amphibian-rich vernal pools on the property, and it's located almost entirely within the Cherry Valley National Wildlife Refuge. After our purchase of the property and prior to transfer, they did a minor boundary adjustment. So this entire property is now within the boundary of Cherry Valley and is owned by the Wildlife Refuge. The Cherry Valley Refuge was opened in 2008 and was established in part to ensure the protection of the bog turtle, which can be found in wetlands throughout the refuge, including on the Pennsylvania American Water property. If anybody from the Fish and Wildlife Service is listening, that is not my hand in the upper left-hand corner. I promise I am not holding bog turtles. So since Cherry Valley opened in 2008, prior to the Pennsylvania American Water Project, they were able to acquire a few small parcels, as shown on the map. That sort of hook shape was Cherry Valley National Wildlife Refuge. But this was the opportunity to secure the first large core land holding for the refuge. So it was a very, very high priority for the refuge to purchase and own this tract. So everything shown there in red were lands which were no longer critical to Pennsylvania American Water's operations, and they were looking to divest. The company retained some adjacent parcels that contain reservoirs, pump stations, and infrastructure that's critical to business operations. So over the years, this land was owned and managed by a series of water companies. And so as such, it remained forested and manages open space to protect water quality. So it was really in pristine condition and a perfect opportunity for a conservation buyer. So we had a willing seller, we had this great conservation opportunity, and as always, all we needed was money. Next slide. So this is where our funding partners, who are listed here on the slide, and also a good relationship with a patient seller, came into play. So this entire project was about $12 million. And with staggered grant deadlines and the appropriations and yellow book appraisal process, it would have been a real challenge, or nearly impossible, to assemble all of these different funding sources into a single package for one closing within a reasonable amount of time for the seller. So to address this and to keep the seller engaged, we split the project into 2 phases. Now, we were fortunate to have some first-in money from National Fish and Wildlife Foundation's Acres for America program, which is funded by Walmart, Northampton County, which about half of this property was within Northampton County, the other half was in Monroe County, and also from the Middle Delaware Mitigation Fund, which is awarded by the National Park Service through the Superintendent of the Appalachian Trail. A quick side note on those first in money, particularly with Northampton County, and sort of I want to highlight the importance of having some local support and local funding available for these projects, even if you're looking at it sort of at the federal level. And the cautionary tale here is it's good to have some local support and funding for unexpected expenses. We did the due diligence on this property, and because of the complexity of the title work that all had to be printed out, it came out to somewhere around 30,000 pages of title work. And the county charges $1 per page, as many county courthouses do, to print that stuff out. So having a relationship with the county, having some funding from the county went a long way to address unexpected expenses that you maybe wouldn't have in your LWCF funding package. So that first money then was quickly followed by a grant from Pennsylvania DCNR through their Conservation Community Partnerships program. So a big thank you to Ashley Rebert and her team, and of course my favorite DCNR staff members, some of whom may be on this call. They're a great funding program here in Pennsylvania, and are very supportive of conservation fund projects and conservation projects all over the state. We also received funding through 2 programs administered by the Open Space Institute, the Delaware River Watershed Protection Fund through the William Penn Foundation, and also the Resilient Landscapes Fund through the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. We also got funding from the Williams Companies through the Atlantic Sunrise Mitigation Fund. Now, these funders were kind enough and flexible enough to phase their grant awards, which allowed TCF to complete phase 1 without federal dollars, without LWCF dollars, and allocating the remainder of the grants to serve as match for LWCF to get us through to complete phase 2. And while I only have funding partners listed here, I do want to note that there were many other supporting organizations that helped to advocate for this project, particularly through the LWCF process. That includes the Nature Conservancy, the Appalachian Trail Conservancy, Monroe County, the Friends of Cherry Valley, Appalachian Mountain Club, LWCF Coalition, and many more who I'm probably missing. But as mentioned before, that coalition and advocacy from a number of different partners is really a key component to getting these LWCF funds approved and allocated for your project. So after we completed phase 1, we did have a nice celebration at the refuge to celebrate the completion, but more importantly, to gain some attention, to get legislators on the site, on the property, to promote advocacy for the LWCF applications that we needed to get phase 2 done. Now, we were lucky enough to be able to structure this project with the funders that LWCF funds were the final piece of the puzzle. And so we eliminated any risk that the awarded LWCF funds would not be able to be swiftly placed into the ground. That gives your legislative leads more confidence to be able to advocate for the program, and really has them as the last folks to bring it over the line. So this project, it's a great LWCF success story. If you haven't been there, I suggest you get out to Cherry Valley National Wildlife Refuge, go see the project, and enjoy everything else that the region has to offer. And I'm happy to take any questions about this at the end or through the chat. Next slide. So I also want to quickly highlight for you, this is like a special bonus surprise forest legacy project for you. And it's something to keep in mind if you're the recipient of a forest legacy grant, or if you're operating in a geography that has recently received funding, or if one of your partner organizations has recently received funding. So back in 2019, the Delaware Highlands Conservancy completed an awesome project called the Northeast Connection easement, forest legacy easement, which is shown in the light purple on the map and is sort of the central focal point there. Now, last year, TCF purchased a high priority conservation parcel called Camp Polly at auction with the intention to transfer the property to PADCNR as part of the adjacent Delaware State Forest. Now, this property came up for auction and we had to act really quickly to secure it. So TCF purchased the property and we're currently in the fundraising process to complete the project so we can get it over to Delaware State Forest. However, due to its close proximity and its similarity in forest cover and conservation benefit to the Northeast Connection project, it is eligible for funds that were not utilized by that project prior to those funds expiring. So the project still has to go through forest legacy review, approval, and the Yellow Book appraisal process. So it's not that much of a shortcut from a transactional time standpoint. However, as a standalone project, this 500-acre parcel, we probably would not have thought to run this through the Forest Legacy or LWCF program. So the take-home message is that if you have an award or if a partner organization has an award and there are any unused but allocated LWCF funds in that project, take a look around to adjacent projects and adjacent areas because there may be opportunities that would be either too small or just maybe not a great candidate to pursue on its own, but you can do that as a complementary or additional project to the previously awarded Forest Legacy or LWCF projects. All right, well, thank you all so much. With that, I will hand it off to Carol with the New Jersey Highlands Council.
Thanks so much, Kyle. I appreciate it. And welcome everybody. Thanks for coming. Again, my name is Carol Dickton. I'm with the New Jersey Highlands Water Protection and Planning Council is our full name, Highlands Council for short. We are an independent state agency. We were created by the 2004 New Jersey Highlands Water Protection and Planning Act, and we are actually a regional planning agency. So among a myriad of other responsibilities that we have, we do operate effectively two land preservation programs. The first one is actually a traditional TDR program, transfer of development rights, and the other one is an open space matching grant program. Because I am based in New Jersey, and I know we have audience members from both New Jersey and PA, I should just caution you that I will give you some overview about the Highlands Conservation Act, but a lot of my perspective is obviously biased by my love for my great garden state. So I've been working with the Highlands Conservation Act since 2016. We have a phenomenal working relationship with U.S. Fish and Wildlife and my counterparts in the other Highlands states. So I do have a sense of some universal truths about the program. So just going to quickly cover the region in general, the Federal Highlands region, for those who aren't familiar, some of the broad brushstrokes about the Highlands Conservation Act and the grant program, and then I'm going to talk about some specific projects we've done in New Jersey. So my real goal is to hope that I help more people understand how this program works in the hopes that we will get more projects into the pipeline. So Danielle, if you could move on to the next slide. Really quick, just wanted to take a look at the overlay of the New Jersey Highlands region, I should say the overall Highlands region, and the Delaware River Watershed. So if you look at the locator map in the bottom right corner, the bright lime green is the 4-state Federal Highlands region. You can sort of see the New Jersey boundary, and there's a blue outline there showing the watershed, the Delaware River Watershed. And what's interesting is the Highlands Federal region and the New Jersey region boundary, which are slightly different. This is the green line here. There are parts of Warren County and Sussex County, New Jersey, that are not actually in the watershed, but there are 42 municipalities in all that are either entirely or partially located in that Delaware River watershed. So it is an important area for us. Danielle, next slide, please. So here's a closer look at that federal highlands region. Again, it extends from Connecticut to Pennsylvania, and it was delineated during early 1990s. There were a couple of U.S. Forest Service studies. The first one was New York and New Jersey in 1992. That was updated in 2002. And then in 2010, you guys can't see where I'm pointing. That's so funny. I'm like pointing to the slides. The book on the top left is the 1992 study, and thank you, Dan. And the 2010 study that added Pennsylvania and Connecticut is down below. The region is based on the underlying geology and the topography. And the studies that were done highlighted the exceptional natural, cultural, historic, agricultural resources present, and the essential, drinking water that's in that region. And also because of the proximity to the New York metropolitan area, the abundant recreational and economic opportunities in the region. So the study basically concluded that because of development pressures that were impeding on the region, the area must be protected. Next slide, please. So thus the Highlands Conservation Act, and I put the full text of the purposes here because I do think it's really important. It covers quite a bit. And the act was passed in 2004 based on data from those U.S. Forest Service studies, USDA Forest Service studies. And as the name implies, the goal was primarily conservation. It's a very brief piece of legislation. It's only 4 pages long, and it's solely focused on getting money to the states for land preservation. Coincidentally, also in 2004, actually in August of 2004, before the federal act was passed, the New Jersey Highlands Water Protection and Planning Act was also passed. And it was a slightly different approach. The Highlands Act addresses natural resource protection through regional planning versus strictly conservation. So it's a bit of a broader scope of looking at it. And the original legislation included an authorized appropriation of $1 million annually for the first 5 years. The first appropriation never happened until 2007. That was $2 million. In 2011, 2013, and 2014, there was no appropriation. In 2016, it bumped up to 10 million, and it's been a little more steady in recent years, but it certainly has been an uneven funding situation in the past. So having the guaranteed steady funding is very helpful. Next slide, please. So some broad brushstrokes of the program. Municipalities, counties, nonprofits cannot apply. Only government agencies can apply. State government entities can apply. There must be a one-to-one cost share match. The match can be a bargain sale, donation by a property owner, which is quite nice and has helped us in a couple of situations. It must be in a high conservation value area as delineated in the studies that were referenced earlier. And there has been talk about updating that and whatnot, but that is the standard right now. Here at the Highlands Council office, we have a phenomenal GIS team, and we actually have that layer, that data layer on our internal mapping. So we can very quickly, if you give us a block and lot, I can tell you right now whether that project is eligible for HCA funding or not. They typically offer 2 types of funding, competitive and non-competitive. The first 2 years that the New Jersey Highlands Council was involved, there was only base funding, and that happens some years there's only base funding. But in the last 2 or 3 years, they've offered both. And the primary difference is just that the base funding is not ranked, and whatever funding is available in that, they sort of allocate equally among the 4-state region. And competitive courses scored and whatnot. Next slide, please. So now we're going to get into the nitty-gritty of the Highlands Act in New Jersey and the impact that it's had. So Green Acres was the lead agency in New Jersey from 2007 to 2016. And in 2016, it transitioned to the Highlands Council. And it's very interesting. Of course, Green Acres purview is the entire state. We have our State Agricultural Development Committee. Their purview is the whole state. The Highlands Council is focused exclusively on the Highlands. So what's been great is we've actually worked in partnership with those sister agencies. And it's a solid partnership because Green Acres knows about open space. We know about the Highlands. SADC knows about farming. We know about the Highlands. So it's been wonderful to explore those partnerships. And recently found out through the HCA, one of the parameters is that the lead agency can actually float among different state agencies, even within a particular funding year. So if you know someone or you're working with Green Acres or something and it happens to be in the Highlands, we should all get on the phone and chat about it because it is it's definitely something worth pursuing because there is quite a bit of funding there. Just quickly, I didn't mean to spend this much time on this slide. The big picture, the big hero shot in the back, that's Ken Lockwood Gorge. And actually all of these are Green Acres acquisitions. This is Northern Green in the upper right-hand corner. Let's see, this one's, thank you. That's Gravel Hill Preserve right below it. And in the bottom left-hand corner, we've got the Rockaway River Wildlife Management Area, and then Sweet Hollow Preserve, cute little sign there up above. That's all written in the caption, but I don't know if y'all can see that. Next slide, please. So next, one of our projects that we closed on last year actually is called the Kugler property. The property owner's name was Kugler. This is located in West Milford. It was a collaboration with TLCNJ, the Land Conservancy of New Jersey. It protects the headwaters of the West Brook, which is a Category 1 trout stream. And TLCNJ is already in the process of undergoing a huge restoration effort on this property. Something to keep in mind, the way the Federal Highlands Conservation Act grant works, the state must be the entity holding the interest that the HCA funds went to. So in this case, TLCNJ was purchasing the property outright. But because they are a nonprofit and not a state agency, the HCA funds could not go towards the purchase of the title. So what we did was the Highlands Council placed a conservation easement on the property. TLCNJ granted us the easement. The easement stays with the property. The HCA funds went to the easement. Green Acres funding was also involved in this project, as was probably a bunch of other stuff. The ultimate plan is that this parcel, this tract, the Kugler property, will add 43 acres to extend the Nancy Conger Westbrook Preserve, which has been expertly managed by TLCNJ for some time, and they will continue to do so. Highlands Council actually put a little funding into the Westbrook Preserve as well, but not through HCA funds. Next slide, please, Danielle. Okay, the Trainer property. So this is Tewksbury Township. By the way, yeah, I pointed out these are not in the Delaware Watershed, so sorry, but just an idea of how this program works, and it could certainly work in the Delaware River Watershed. So Tewksbury Township, this was a partnership with our primary partner that we worked with was NJCF, but Tewksbury Land Trust and the Township of Tewksbury were looking to acquire this property for passive recreation purposes. And it's a largely, as you can see from these pictures, wooded property. There was originally a 3-lot subdivision approved for this property. So always a nice win when we can prevent that from happening. And again, here, the property owners, the Trainer family, sold the title to NJCF. And then NJCF actually, we placed the easement on the property. This all happened simultaneously at closing. We placed the easement on the property as NJCF held the property, and then they transferred it to Tewksbury Land Trust and the Township of Tewksbury, who are in the process of cleaning up this property and managing it for, a natural area. Eventually, there will be public hiking trails on that property. Next slide, please. I'm spending a lot of time on these. I love these properties. I'm so proud of us. Belle Meade. So Belle Meade actually was supposed to close 2 days ago. It hasn't closed yet, but it's going to close this week. This is Tewksbury again in Hunterdon County. Partner was NJCF. There was intense development pressure on this site. It was actually intended to become an office park. It's very close, for anyone who's familiar with New Jersey geography, it's very close to a major highway, Route 78, which will also make it great for public access to open space when it gets there. So it was a nice thing to have brought to our attention by NJCF. And similarly with the others, it's going from the property owner to NJCF. The Highlands Council will place an easement on it at that stage, and then it'll be transferred to Hunterdon County, who will, I believe the intent is to ultimately make it part of the Hunterdon County Park system. And again, it's closing any minute. Next slide, please. And this is the last little success story I'll share with you guys. And I wanted to add this one because this is, I had mentioned earlier that we have 2 preservation programs. One is an open space matching grant and the other is a transfer of development rights program. This is actually property that was acquired through our transfer of development rights program using Highlands Conservation Act funds. So our TDR, our Transfer of Development Rights program, is called the Highlands Development Credit Program because we just can't come up with enough 3-letter acronyms for you. HDC, TDR, HCA, write it down, there'll be a quiz later. So the Highlands Act as it was written provides funding for planning grants. It did not provide funding for land acquisition. However, it did specify the development of a transfer of development rights program as a means of protecting areas from potential development. And we were given an initial base of funding from the state for $10 million for easement acquisitions through the HDC program. And in 2016, the Highlands Council, when we were granted access to these federal funds, started using those funds to acquire development credits through the HDC program. So in this case, the property owner, the bi-county, the full name of the property owner is actually bi-county development. The property was initially zoned for townhomes. And then when the Highlands Act, the New Jersey Highlands Act came in, the development potential of that property diminished. And there were still tremendous resources present on that site. So our valuation process in our HDC program takes into account the value of the natural resources present, as well as the development potential that would have existed had the Highlands Act not been in place. So the Highlands Council then purchases the credits that are allocated to the property that reflect that value, and we in turn place an easement on the property. So in this case, the original owner retains the title. Conservation easement is on the property and will run with the land. So should this property owner eventually choose to sell it, and to be clear, it is surrounded by other preserved open spaces. So it would be a lovely extension to any number of other preserved lands. They can do that, and the property is protected forever. It currently has no public access, but that potential certainly exists. So that's just a slightly different way of going at leveraging these HCA funds. So next slide, please. In summary, if it's in the Highlands, think of the Highlands Conservation Act. If you're not sure if it's in the Highlands, give us a call. Again, we got this fabulous GIS data layer. We can probably find out for you. And again, I'm sorry I'm being so Jersey specific, but PA, you have the same things, I'm sure. And I can get you the name of the contact for the HCA over there. I don't have it. I should have thought I had that, but I don't. What's cool is lots of any size are eligible for this. There's no minimum, no lot too small, too big. You know, we live in New Jersey, the most densely populated state. Parcels can be small, but we'll take big parcels too. Forest resources, agricultural, recreational, cultural, the whole gamut. There's a lot of flexibility here, and our federal partners really want to see this money leveraged. So we can definitely, Dan Pierce is the man, whoever put that in there. Yeah, rock on. That is that. Thank you. In the chat, folks. Next slide, please, Danielle. This is just our contact information. And the one thing I want to point out here is that you'll see, here's my name. James Humphreys is our Director of Planning and Science. He's here somewhere in this group, and I have your name here on the last spot because we currently have a job opening for a regional planner, land preservation coordinator, who would really be the head honcho on this, not me, if that position were filled. So please feel free to visit our website and check out that job posting. I think it's open until next Friday, I think. So anyway, and so with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Bryant, I think, with Camden Community Partnership. She's going to talk about Sadler's Point Waterfront Park. Thanks, everybody.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. Unfortunately, we in Camden, I think, are not in the Highlands, but so we won't be able to look you up, but I guess we'll have to live with that. My name is Sarah Bryant. As was mentioned, I'm the Director of Community Initiatives at Camden Community Partnership, which was formerly, until recently, called Cooper's Ferry Partnership. But it's a nonprofit based in the city of Camden that is an economic and development corporation that serves as a catalyst for the preservation and growth of a vibrant and healthy city of Camden. And I am going to talk about a project that has been near and dear to my heart for about a decade, actually more than a decade. I don't want to admit that, but called Sadler's Point Waterfront Park. And the reason why I'm talking about it today, it is a project that is funded by ORLAP, or as I have always said, ORLP, because I wasn't in the loop on the right acronym, but we're very thankful to have the support of that program for this project, and we're really excited to be able to bring this project to fruition over the next couple of years. So next slide, please. So just to take a step back and just talk about Camden in general for a moment. Camden, I'm sure most of you on the call are pretty familiar with the city of Camden, but just to do a quick overview related to its waterfront access. So Camden's a pretty small city in terms of landmass, but it has a ton of waterfront land. So it's 14 plus miles of waterfront, surrounded on 3 sides by the Delaware River, the Cooper River, and the Newton Creek. Unfortunately, and this is a story that you hear in any other industrial city, historically Camden's residents have been unable to access and enjoy its beautiful waterfronts due to other uses being placed on those waterfronts. So industry, prisons, wastewater treatment plants, things like that. So historically, there were only 3 access points to the river, to the waterfront in Camden. Luckily, due to a lot of hard work and a lot of determination by the Camden community over the last decade or so, that's really begun to swing in a positive direction. And so I'm happy to report back to the group that there are now 6 more access points to the water, which is a major shift, and as a result of a lot of neighborhood planning and then a lot of support for the implementation of those neighborhood plans, and a lot of partners, some of which are on this call, working very hard to kind of make this happen. And so there's 6 more public access points. I mean, that's a lot of acres of public waterfront land. Sadler's Point Waterfront Park, this project is the next one, and that is I lost my, I did have some stars in here, but it seems like they got lost. It's just on the kind of top center of we'll dive in. But this project is, just to provide a bit of history on it, it came to fruition through a neighborhood planning effort in the North Camden neighborhood of Camden, About 12 years ago, it was envisioned in that plan that a continuous waterfront park and trail would be developed along the North Camden waterfront, which at the time only had one public access point to the water, and is surrounded, as you can see kind of on the image below, by water. And so this is a big step in the right direction towards making that goal and that dream happen. And so it's a project that the community is very excited about, and we've been excited about too, and happy to share it with you today. So next slide, please. Oh, and I just had to put in a few pretty pictures, but these are some of the waterfront parks that have come to be in Camden in the last couple of years that certainly each have their own story to tell, and I won't get into it. I'll get derailed, but these are all great parks that I invite you to visit. And if you want any more information about them, I'd be happy to share. So get in touch. Next slide, please. So Sadler's Point Waterfront Park. So just to dive in, just with an aerial as to where we're located here. This is the North Camden neighborhood, as I mentioned, right on the Delaware River back channel, which is such a pristine and beautiful location. Petty's Island is right across from the site of the park. Philadelphia is kind of to the west. It's located just to the east of an active recreation park, which is one of kind of the busiest parks in the city of Camden, called Pine Point Park. The property itself is about 16 acres. It's a half mile of waterfront land. So it's a pretty significant amount of space. It has a history as an industrial use. It is a brownfield with a lot of contamination as a result of its industrial background, which has been a significant part of the project. It is several different parcels we're working on finalizing the subdivision for. It is currently, and we'll go to the next slide, we can see some images of what it looks like currently, but it is vacant currently. It's been vacant for a long time. And as a result, it has become, unfortunately, a dumping ground, a place where, unfortunately, over the years, and less so now, but a lot of drug use and other things happened. And so as a result, it is not a pleasant environment right now, but it is, as you can see from these pictures, very beautiful views, very kind of serene, lots of ecological value right on the Delaware. So such potential. Next slide, please. And so here's our site plan, which is, not very exciting to look at. And I apologize. I wish I had something better, but this kind of represents what's going on with the project. Just some of the features of the project. So it's a passive park that is supposed to complement Pine Point Park, which is the neighboring active recreation park. And so some of the passive uses that we have incorporated into the park based on kind of community feedback over the years include a boat launch for non-motorized boats, a boardwalk overlook, and a continuous waterfront trail through the entire site, which is going to be part of the circuit, which is cool. Picnic areas, standard amenities like lighting and things like that. Parking too, actually, because it is a difficult site to get to without it, I would say. And then we've really tried to, do our best to preserve what's already there, the good of what's already there. And so we're keeping as much existing foliage as we can wherever possible, which is a delicate balance because it's also a contaminated site that requires a cap. So there's a balance there that had to be kind of reached. We're also doing, pervious paving, stormwater management, things like that, just trying to, make it as ecologically friendly as possible. Next slide, please. Just to zoom in for a second and talk about the boat launch, which is kind of a really exciting piece of this project. The red star, it represents where the boat launch is in the site plan. The yellow is where currently a lot of non-motorized boating is happening just in kind of an informal boat launch that's been created on the edge of Pine Point Park, which is part of the project area. And there's been a lot of kayaking, canoeing, a lot of events. There's some partners on this call that have really worked hard on this too, to getting people out on the water. It's an amazing experience being out on the water, the Cooper River and the Delaware River, looking back at Camden. It's really a beautiful place. And so that's been a major initiative, and we're really excited to have the boat launch be part of the project, because it gives people, we don't really have an actual access point, a designed and constructed access point. So it's very excited to have that in there. Next slide, please. And these renderings, unfortunately, are dated. They're from the neighborhood plan that envisioned this park. 08 was what, 14 years ago now. But they do give you a sense from an aerial perspective of the size of the space, and also what it could look like, and what it will look like to a certain extent when it's completed. Next slide, please. And here's the fun stuff. So just a little bit digging in on the funding, the timeline, and some of the challenges that we've faced along the way. We have 6 different funding sources for this project, running the gamut from NJDOT Transportation Alternatives Program funding, which is funding kind of the trail portions of the project, to obviously ORLAP we've talked about, to state funding, such as New Jersey DEP Green Acres, local funding from Camden County. It's all in there. And so jumping down to challenges, certainly we're very lucky to have received and identified the funding that we have for the project. But it is a challenge balancing all the different funding sources, and identifying, what funds what, and making sure that we're keeping up with all of the administrative side of all those grants and things. So that's definitely a challenge for the project. It is a $4.5 million project, including design and construction. As I mentioned, it's been in design for about a decade. And we're really excited that at this point, we're done with design, we're done with permitting, we're done with developing our remedial action work plan. We are just seeking some of our final authorizations to proceed with the project. And we expect to go out to bid in the second quarter of this year, with a construction start hopefully in the third quarter. And then it's a large project, so it's going to be about a year-long construction project. So hopefully we will welcome you all for the ribbon cutting in, let's say, Q3, Q4 2023. And in terms of challenges, there's been many, as there are with any project, but just to highlight a few, certainly the environmental investigation was more complex than we realized going into it, because of it being a large waterfront site with a history of industrial uses and contamination. We certainly had to learn a lot along the way as we went through that process. Ownership, I mentioned, it's several different parcels that are being consolidated, some of which are owned by the city of Camden, which is going to be the eventual owner of the entire site, and it will be part of the city's park system. But some of the properties were also privately owned. There were some properties there was one property in particular that no one knew who owned it, and was mislabeled on every tax map. So that was about a year's worth of digging to try and get to the bottom of that one. So property ownership has certainly been a challenge for the project, and consolidating. Permitting also, just because of the nature of the site, because it's a waterfront brownfield, half mile long. Funding, as I mentioned, just balancing all of the different funding sources, and also raising enough money to do the project certainly has been a challenge over the years. And then just one other thing to mention too, with the boat launch, it's been a challenge and an opportunity as well. initially we had a motorized boat launch in the plan, which was something that came straight out of the neighborhood plan that I've mentioned before. But over the years, kind of the sentiment on the motorized boat launch shifted, and the community and other stakeholders and partners became more interested in non-motorized boat launch that would support non-motorized kayak canoe use as opposed to motorized boat use, that and serve to kind of preserve that pristine element of the Delaware River back channel, which is considered to be one of the most beautiful spaces for that kind of activity in our region. And so we ended up going back to the drawing board. We took out the motorized boat launch. We put in the non-motorized, and I think we're really excited to bring it to fruition now. And I think, let me see, next slide, please. I think that might be it for me. But I thank you for your time, and happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks again. And I'm going to pass it to Ashley.
Thank you, Sarah. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ashley Rebert. I am the section manager for land conservation and stewardship within the Bureau of Recreation Conservation, PADCNR. I'm also state liaison officer to the LWCF program, and I'm joined today by my colleague Alex Titanish, who is the Land and Water Conservation Fund program specialist, also assistant state or alternate state liaison officer. And Alex will join us for this discussion after the slide presentations. I did put Dan Pierce's contact information in the chat if anybody would like to get in touch with Dan about the Highlands Conservation Act fund that he administers in Pennsylvania. Feel free to do that. Next slide, please. In Pennsylvania, we have an annual grant program administered by the Bureau called the Community Conservation Partnership Program. This program combines several state and federal legislated funding sources, as you can see noted on the slide. The Bureau provides grants and technical assistance under the authority of each of these enabling legislations to communities and organizations across Pennsylvania for local recreation projects, trails and greenways, regional heritage parks, open space protection, river conservation, and environmental education programs. Next slide. Specific to the Land and Water Conservation Fund program, eligible applicants in our state are municipalities and municipal agencies, counties, some state agencies and school districts. Eligible project types include the acquisition of properties to support future public outdoor recreation areas and the development of new parks, as well as rehabilitation of existing parks, trails, recreation areas that focus on providing outdoor recreation amenities and waterway access. We also use the funding to help develop trail projects, particularly closing priority trail gaps within Pennsylvania. Next slide, please. Our grant process starts with a notice of available funding, and that goes out through a variety of media channels, through newsletters. We do direct legislative notification. We put a notice in the Pennsylvania Bulletin, and we also conduct grant workshops across the state in the fall prior to the application period. The open application period is January through April. And then we undergo a rigorous scoring process that's based on standard selection criteria. And each project is scored and ranked by at least 2 staff. And then we have joint meetings conducted to do final review, ranking, and make recommendations. During this process, recommendations are also made at a statewide level, selecting the best applications to put forward for Land and Water Conservation Fund application. We notify applicants of award between October and December of that same year. And then we work with those selected applicants to complete the supplemental documents required to seek National Park Service review and approval of an application. Next slide. Each state must complete a statewide comprehensive outdoor recreation plan every 5 years in order to receive land and water conservation funds. Our current plan was updated in 2020 and expires the end of 2024. This is a plan with extensive public input to determine the recreation needs of Pennsylvania residents. Our current plan priorities are listed on the slide. Planning and development projects focused on access for all and rehabilitating existing parks, land conservation projects that protect critical habitat, climate resilient lands, forested watersheds, and riparian corridors, projects that enhance public access to Pennsylvania's waterways or projects that improve Pennsylvania's watersheds, projects that close priority trail gaps, and projects that address a recreation access need in a high or medium need area or an underserved population. Next slide. I'm sorry this slide isn't very pretty, but it represents the projects that have been funded across Pennsylvania through the Land and Water Conservation Fund. So the red and blue dots are acquisition sites, the yellow are development sites. And you can see that land and water conservation funding has gone to every county in Pennsylvania, resulting in the permanent protection of more than 33,000 acres of local parkland. Land and water conservation funding has provided funding to 1,600 unique projects, and 338 of those are within the Delaware watershed. Next slide. Now we get on to challenges and opportunities. Probably one of the biggest challenges in Pennsylvania is timing. Our state grant process takes about a year from the time of application to award, if you remember from the earlier slide. And once an application is selected for state award, we work with those applicants to complete the supplemental documentation for the federal application. And we wait for an open notice of funding opportunity from National Park Service. Sometimes this can lead to significant delays depending on NPS backlog, available staff at the local level to complete the required documents, and the amount of compliance work that might be needed at a specific site. And projects must be 100% ready to go before we apply for federal funding. So it can take some time to work through that process. The timing issue then can create challenges for municipalities when it comes to budgeting for project expenses. Match sources, might not be available anymore. And the delay in being able to release bid documents can lead to some scoping and budget issues. I'm sure other states have witnessed this lately, but the fluctuating rise in construction costs, as well as the challenge to find available materials, has also led to some challenges that will hopefully improve as time goes on here. In addition, some municipalities just might not have the capacity to front the money since the Land and Water Conservation Fund is a reimbursement only program. Sometimes it just doesn't work out if a municipality doesn't have the funds available at the front end. So there's lots of opportunities and ways that our nonprofit partners can help. And we're so grateful for our partners, our nonprofit partners who've advocated for the LWCF program and led the way for the reauthorization in 2019. But we need to keep that momentum going. So your support for local and state matching sources is tremendously helpful, and helping communities find those sources of funds so that they can realize their successful projects. Nonprofit partners can also help support municipalities in the application and grant administration process by helping communities identify local needs that address priorities outlined in our state comprehensive outdoor recreation plan, and helping applicants develop or helping municipalities develop competitive applications. We can drive funding into those high need priority areas within our state. And communication and training is always needed at all program levels to build awareness around the availability of funding, to provide training on the federal process updates that get rolled out, and on compliance and stewardship issues. There are many opportunities to assist with communication around this program, and this webinar is one of them. So I'm so thankful that we have the opportunity to be here today. Next slide, please. Just going to highlight one project, and that is the Knothstein Preserve in Paradise Township, Monroe County. In 2006, DCNR provided matching funds through the Land and Water Conservation Fund program to Paradise Township to acquire the preserve. Monroe County Open Space Program provided the match, and the Knothstein Preserve spans 150 acres of pristine forest in the Pocono region. It protects more than a mile of the Cranberry Creek, which is a high quality cold water fishery. And the Cranberry Creek flows into the Broadhead Watershed, which leads into the Delaware and eventually the Atlantic. The preserve provides 3.5 miles of trails and about 1/2 mile of ADA accessible path through the forest. And this is just one example of the tremendous local impact that the Land and Water Conservation Fund has had on our state. Next slide. That's the end of our presentation, and thank you all for listening. And Alex and I will be happy to answer any questions anybody has once we get to that point in the program. And I will pass it on to Courtney in New Jersey.
Hi. First, I wanted to say thank you to AMC and CDW and all the nonprofits and organizations that made today's session possible. I think it's these kind of conversations that are so important to making sure that we're all, using our resources effectively and coordinating, because it's quite an undertaking. A lot of the projects that we've heard about today, and they take partners and they take resourcefulness and they take creative thinking, and sessions like this, I think, stimulate all of that. So thank you for bringing us all together. I'm thrilled to be here today to talk about the Land and Water Conservation Fund and how we administer it in New Jersey. My name is Courtney Wald-Whitcup, and I work for the Department of Environmental Protection, specifically the Green Acres program. And I am recent to the Land and Water Conservation Fund coordinator position. My predecessor, Steve Jandilli, who I think is on the call, retired in 2019, and I stepped into some very big shoes, but it's a fantastic program, and it's a pleasure every day to get to kind of interact with the federal counterparts, state coordinators like Ashley and Alex, and then also all of the nonprofits and the local governments, and just everybody who gets involved with sort of the spirit and intent behind the Land and Water Conservation funding. The Land and Water funding in New Jersey, oh, next slide, Daniel, sorry. The Land and Water funding that we use in New Jersey is kind of a multitude. I think we're gonna spend most of today talking about what's called the Land and Water Stateside Assistance Funding, but we do also utilize federal forest legacy money. We use Section 6 funding through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And we have become quite big proponents of the use of the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Program. And Sarah did a lovely job highlighting the Camden project. This is such an important program for a state like New Jersey that is so densely populated that we really want to encourage our densely populated cities and urban areas and communities in general to participate in that kind of a program. And I'll talk more about that as we go. Next slide, please. The Land and Water Conservation Administration in New Jersey is done by the Green Acres program, but it's important to note that the Green Acres program is sort of the state program responsible for open space and outdoor recreation planning and investment. We are very blessed in New Jersey. We have a tremendous funding support that comes through the corporate business tax and the Garden State Preservation Trust, and we've had amazing nonprofit allies that have allocated resources and time and lobbied to make sure that that funding is available for farmland preservation, open space, protection, for historic, and then for a lot of the improvements that are needed to state parks and wildlife management areas. And this year, or I should say last year, 2021, the Green Acres program received $162 million for both our local and nonprofit program, our state acquisition program. So we get a lot of resources at the state level, which allow us to sort of use our land and water conservation funds in a very particular manner. And just to kind of talk for a minute about some of the programs Green Acres administers, our local and nonprofit program provides grants and loans to counties, towns, and nonprofits for projects that include things like park improvements, acquisitions, and we also provide stewardship grants. Those are to nonprofits and towns or counties. And last year there was $95 million awarded across a suite of those sort of subsets. And it's something I'm incredibly proud of, because conservation in a state like New Jersey really takes lots of partners, and it can't be done by any one agency or entity. And so without programs like Green Acres to encourage local partnerships, some of which I think Carol did a beautiful job highlighting, it really takes the nonprofits to help get some of these across the finish line. It takes our municipalities and our counties, and it does take some of the state funding to really make them happen. On the state land acquisition side, this is where I use the phrase, we act as sort of the glorified real estate agents for the Division of Fish and Wildlife and Parks and Forestry and Natural Lands. We also run a Blue Acres program where we acquire flood-prone or storm-vulnerable properties. We buy them from the homeowner, willing sellers only, knock the home down after acquisition, and we kind of deed restrict it as open space in perpetuity. And we've successfully leveraged that funding through several different federal sources, FEMA through the Department of Homeland Security, and then also through HUD with the Community Development Block Grant monies. And then another important part of the Green Acres program is our Legal Services and Stewardship Bureau. They handle things like the State House Commission diversions or issues where parkland needs to kind of be released and replaced. And they also do all of our compliance inspections. So when we talk about land and water, compliance is an important component, making sure that it stays open for public recreation and outdoor, it's an outdoor resource in perpetuity. And they're also sort of responsible for overseeing our recreation and open space inventory process. And believe it or not, but in New Jersey, we actually preserve more land through the recreation and open space inventory process than through anything else. And to date, I think we now have, 1.6 million acres preserved here in New Jersey. For a small state, that's something we're pretty proud of. Next slide. So to date, we've been awarded about $133 million in land and water stateside assistance funding, and our relationship with land and water does go back quite a long way. The Green Acres program has been in existence since 1961, and our relationship with the land and water program was born in 1965. So we've been partners from the beginning. And the land and water money has gone to a substantial preservation sort of portfolio, if you will. About 80,000 acres and over 250 parks and recreation areas have been developed from top to bottom in New Jersey. Next slide. So this is where I wanted to highlight a little bit of the differences. Pennsylvania runs a tremendous program, and they do incredible work. And I will admit later on that I'm jealous of your SCORP, but the New Jersey program is more of a we keep the funding internally, I guess is the simple way to explain it. Like we have our dedicated Green Acres money through that corporate business tax that I explained a couple minutes ago. So we can kind of keep those apportionment funds and use them to expand our state parks and wildlife management areas, to enhance urban parks that wouldn't be competitive under ORLAP, and then also to make improvements to state parks and wildlife management areas. And we really try and use it to leverage some of the funds that are made available through our state land acquisition program, through the parks capital funding that's out there, and then really kind of looking at some of those more urban communities. We've done a lot of work with Patterson and some of those areas where it's super important that these projects get completed. They have relevance not just to sort of the local city level, but they also fall into sort of a larger scape. A lot of the funding through land and water that we've spent in Patterson complements the National Historic Site that's there, and then also some of the work that the city and the county are doing as well. So next slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about ORLAP because Sarah did a really nice job highlighting one of our ORLAP projects here in New Jersey, but we also do, we've made a real big push for ORLAP in the past two years, and we've wanted to make sure that the use of ORLAP is something that we're encouraging. And we know it can be a little tricky to work with, but it is a matching grant program. The awards can range anywhere from about 300,000 to 5 million. We act as the pass-through, so the state actually ensures that a local entity like a city or a county can apply to us, and we create basically a notice of funding opportunity on our website, and through emails and letters that are sent directly to eligible communities, we say, if you have a project, come talk to us. And those projects can be acquisition, they can be park improvements, or they can be sort of a combination of both. But there is that population eligibility requirement. So we are looking for communities of about 50,000 or more. And there is a census data layer that we make available whenever the ORLAP announcement goes out. We pre-screen those. We work with our counterparts at National Park Service to make sure that those applications are going to be eligible in that funding cycle. And then, we kind of make sure that those projects can get proposed when that notice of funding opportunity becomes available. I think it's important to note that sometimes there are nuances in those notices of funding opportunity. I'm sure that, like a lot of federal sources, you have the devil's in the details, right? You have to really read carefully. Sometimes there'll be important elements that they want emphasized, things like job creation or connectivity or things like that. New Jersey was actually super proud over the past year, I'll say it like that. We had projects in 2020 that were ranked first and second nationally, and there was about $40 million available through the ORLAP program. Then right in 2021, they actually blew it up, and there's about 150 million nationally available. So we submitted 4 separate applications. And so we see that the future of ORLAP is pretty important. And we see it as an opportunity for a lot of our more densely populated and urban areas. And we're hoping for some really great news, in the next, say 6 to 8 weeks about those applications that were submitted last year. It is a pre-application process. So you submit pre-applications, and then if it's reviewed by the national panel and ranked for approval, they'll let you apply in sort of the full application period. Next slide. So kind of to talk a little bit about some of the challenges of land and water and some of the opportunities associated with land and water in New Jersey. It's similar to what I think the recommendations were in Pennsylvania, but also a little different. From a challenge perspective, I think we struggle with a lack of federal funding for program administration. Here in New Jersey, it's me. I'm your land and water coordinator. I deal with all the conversions. I deal with all the applications. I'm the conduit for the ORLAP submissions, as well as for making sure we apply on the state side. And then just kind of fielding questions and things like that. So it would be great if we could have some more robust program administration funding, because it would be wonderful to have, another person or two that could help. We also have the SCORP, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, but we're updating our SCORP like now. And the interesting thing about that is it's pretty time consuming, and it's wonderful, and it's an important visioning document, but that also comes with the ability to apply for some planning grants, which we were successful in securing, but now we have to kind of balance doing all of that planning and visioning along with sort of the program administration. And then I think in recent years, we've seen a lot of transition within National Park Service's staff. They've, brought new people on board, and then they've had just some changes, whether it's from federal regulatory changes or there was a new manual that was sort of like released and then kind of walked back. So I think they've had some struggles, which have led to some delays in terms of how quickly they're reviewing applications and how responsive they are on making conversion determinations. So I think those are some challenges that we do wrestle with, and we hope optimistically that things are going to get better as we all hit our stride, so to speak. And I think when we talk about opportunities, I think that there's so much advocacy work still to do. I mean, I know full funding was a tremendous accomplishment, and it took, it was the yeoman's load. It took a lot of effort and time. But I still think that, where there are projects, whether nonprofit partners reach out to me or others at the Green Acres program and say, hey, would this make a good land and water project, or would this make a good ORLAP project? I think just being willing to have those kinds of conversations and make suggestions is critically important. I think there's going to be changes to ORLAP. We're pretty sure of that. The question is how. This increase in funding has definitely led to arguments about expanding sort of the definition of what populations or what communities are eligible and things like that. So I think, if you're an organization that values what ORLAP can offer, it's important to stay engaged in those conversations and make sure that sort of the spirit and intent of ORLAP doesn't change. And then I think, there are other federal changes that we sort of hear about as program coordinators, some of which materialize and some of which don't. But I think anytime you can keep your kind of ear to the ground and make sure that some of those decisions allow the programs to operate the way they should. I mean, I think we all know that LWCF, no matter the program, is about partnerships. And so anything that's going to make partnerships easier, I think is critical to sort of the success of our ability to use this great infusion of funds following the approval of the Great American Outdoor Act. And then I have to make a plug when I talk about opportunities. We are updating our SCORP. And so we need the public support. We want the engagement. Next slide. So we're literally embarking on this right now. And it is a fundamental part. I think Ashley did a lovely job of explaining sort of what the SCORP is in Pennsylvania. And our current SCORP is very similar, but our next SCORP is going to include some stuff that we haven't typically done in New Jersey. So we're going to do some original research, some survey and some polling, a very extensive and aggressive public engagement schedule. And we're really focusing on things like outdoor recreation and conservation equity for everyone. We're going to look a lot at climate change and sustainability solutions when it comes to outdoor recreation and conservation. And we're going to talk about how community health and wellness is kind of intertwined with conservation and economic development. So a little bit of those ecotourism conversations and a little bit of a discussion about the impacts of social media and the evolving role of technology in outdoor recreation. And so I encourage you, as your groups are involved, and just to keep your, to be out there and engage, and to remind people when the survey's out, forward it, because we want responses. We want to hear from people. We want to have a dialogue, and it's super important that this next SCORP update includes everyone's voice, and that it's not just a plan that DEP does, but that it's a plan for New Jersey. Next slide. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on projects, but we have done several throughout the Delaware River Watershed or corridor. They run the gamut from things like boat ramps to acquisitions up at Jenny Jump. We've done Delaware River access sites acquisitions and improvements. We've done a lot of development grants for state parks, things that have made places like Spruce Run and Round Valley better. Next slide. And I wanted to take 1 minute and just kind of share with the group. I'm also the State Forest Legacy Coordinator, and historically New Jersey's Forest Action Plan only identified a forest legacy area for us to do acquisition and easement work in the Highlands. But last year, I guess I should say 2020, but it was kind of finally approved last year. The new Forest Action Plan actually expands our forest legacy areas. So now forest legacy funding and projects can be identified in the Pinelands, the coastal zone, and the natural, some of our natural heritage priority sites. And so for us, we see that as a great opportunity to sort of expand the use and the applicability of the forest legacy funding throughout the state of New Jersey. So that was a ton of information. And I'm happy to take questions, but thank you for your time, and just bottom line, thank you for your interest in land and water, because I think it's an incredibly important part of the preservation strategy that we have here in the tri-state.
Thanks, Courtney. That was a ton of information. That was a ton of information from everybody, which is awesome. So thank you. I mean, we're recording the webinar, so we'll send out a copy of the recording to everybody so you can look back and say, what was that about ORLAP, or how does it work in Pennsylvania? And we'll send a copy of the slide deck as well. So you'll have this final slide with everyone's contact information. So I encourage folks to reach out. One of the questions that came in, the earliest question was, how can small, mostly volunteer watershed associations best take advantage of LWCF funding? And honestly, I think, after listening to this program, you may have some ideas based on where you are and what kind of projects you're interested in. You may be in a rural area, you may be in a suburban or urban area, you may be in the Highlands, you may not. So you may have an idea of which of these tools might work for whatever acquisition you might have in mind, if that's what you're looking to do. I would encourage you to reach out, talk to you've heard today that it's really about partnerships. Nobody does one of these projects alone. Even like big groups like the Conservation Fund have a lot of partners that come together to make these things happen. So talk to the town, the municipality, the county, talk to your local land trust, talk to bigger land trust organizations like the Conservation Fund or the Trust for Public Land, and definitely reach out to all of these experts on different pieces of LWCF to figure out which piece of it might work best for you. But as you have heard, there's lots of different tools that you can partner with different partners to access. And then there's lots of advocacy opportunities at the state level, engaging on SCORP, fighting for more resources at the state level, working with us at the national level through the LWCF Coalition to influence the federal side of things. And as Courtney alluded to, there are changes being contemplated to ORLP. I'm sorry, for some reason I can't call it ORLAP. I always call it ORLP. A lot of groups are keenly interested in expanding access for all, and are looking at ways that the program is working well, and ways that some communities still can't access it. And so they are talking about, providing some flexibility about match, providing lowering the population threshold so that more communities that are clearly urbanized but their jurisdictions don't meet that high population threshold that ORLP currently has, can participate. And so we're happy to discuss any and all of these things that you may be interested in, but I hope that folks will engage. Does anybody else want to comment on that question about how small, mostly volunteer watershed associations can best access funding? Okay, so then another question was regarding the FY22 LWCF earmark. It's not actually an earmark, it's a project that was on the president's budget list, but it's just semantics, for the NPS Upper Delaware project that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. Lori Ramey says, we understand no monies may be spent under the federal government's continuing resolution, and that the Conservation Fund is interested in purchasing some of the Boy Scouts acreage to turn it over to the New York State DEC, meaning there may not be any land left to pursue by the time LWCF could be utilized. The Greater New York Council of Boy Scouts of America is currently applying to subdivide much of their 12,000 acres. I've actually seen a lot of projects lately that involve land owned by Boy Scouts of America. I think the changing demographics of scouting are impacting their desire to hold so much land, and so there's a tremendous opportunity there. And there's also a tremendous threat that a lot of these lands that people may not even realize are privately held would then be closed off. So I think it's an interesting trend. No money can be spent right now under the continuing resolution, but Congress actually just struck a deal this week to move forward with the FY22 Omnibus Appropriations Act. So hopefully that is coming to an end, knock on wood. in the next month. So these projects would be able to move forward. I'm not aware of the situation with the Conservation Fund in New York State. I don't know, Kyle, if you're still on, if you can address that piece of it.
Yeah, hi, Amy. I'm not sure I can really address that piece of it. I mean, that project is ongoing and I don't have any real details that I can share with the group.
Okay. I think, though, that regardless of how that moves forward, we have definitely focused a lot on making sure that LWCF funds are reprogrammed. So if that project goes through, and then, any funds that, may have been intended for that can be used for another project. As Kyle mentioned, in the Forest Legacy context, there's some leftover funds from the Northeast Connection project that may be utilized in adjacent properties. Similarly, with the federal agencies, we have fought really hard to make sure that if a project falls through, or money remains unspent after a couple of years and the project is clearly is definitely dead, that money can be reprogrammed, because there are so many more projects waiting in the wings rather than being rescinded or taken back by Congress. And so we were successful in making sure that the current FY22 appropriations bill that will hopefully pass in the next month has no rescissions or takebacks of prior LWCF funds, but reprograms them. Because beyond the list of projects for this year that can be funded at $900 million, there's another $200 million worth of projects on a supplemental list that could be done this year that are ready to go projects, but that wouldn't be funded even at $900 million annually. So we are looking for any and all ways to address those unmet needs to boost that funding. There was some potential funding in the Build Back Better Act for Forest Legacy and also for ORLP. There's another piece of legislation called the Parks, Jobs, and Equity Act that would put more money into ORLP. There's always going to be the potential for other avenues. And so again, if you stay engaged with us in CDRW and the LWCF Coalition, we will let you know about when opportunities are coming and we can all advocate together to keep the funding as high as possible. I think I saw one more question in the chat that was for Courtney. Hold on. What's the best New Jersey Green Acres funding source for trails development on public or nonprofit owned land?
Yeah, that was a question from Wendy. And Wendy, I was starting to type one, but I realized it might be more useful if you tell me where you are, because there is certainly Green Acres funding available for trails, and for trail projects. A little bit of it is that sort of devil in the details in terms of where and the scope and size to sort of make the best recommendation. What I was going to suggest is maybe if you can drop your email into the chat and just tell me the location, I can hook you up with the Green Acres project manager who you can talk to directly.
And even though it wasn't directed to me, I'll just add a little plug for the other part of my job, the New Jersey Highlands Council. We have planning grants available for municipalities and counties, and a trail has to start with a plan. We can't cover hard costs, but we can cover the planning grant. So if you happen to be in the New Jersey Highlands or anybody else, that's another great partnership point that, like Courtney talked about, we have different agencies cover different things. So planning grants for trails, think Highlands Council. I'm such an advertiser and I don't mean to be, sorry.
That's okay. I love that, actually. We're all advertisers for what we do, and it adds up to a lot of great work. And so, I think I started this webinar by talking about the great achievements that we were able to make in the Great American Outdoors Act, partly to inspire you all to think, there are challenges with doing any of these projects and with keeping this momentum going, but there is no limit to what we can all do with perseverance and partnerships. So congratulations to all of you project folks who have worked so hard and persevered with your projects to do great things. And I can't wait to see what more we can do with this funding moving forward. Thank you so much to all our panelists, and thanks to everybody who joined. This was great.
Thank you so much, everyone. I just want to thank all of our attendees and our panelists once again. Following this webinar, all registrants will be sent a recording of today's presentation, along with a recording of the webinar. And so keep an eye out for that in your email. That concludes today's webinar on taking advantage of full LWCF funding within the Delaware River Watershed. So take care and have a great afternoon, everyone.